yeah, Ukraine is nowhere near a democratic society, and it hasn't been for a long time, and it's just absurd. How it's held up is like, here's this bastion of democracy against evil authoritarian Russians. But we know that, and it's all about whose side you're on. Democracy is just an excuse. And obviously they're not interested in the substance of democracy. They just redefined democracy to mean, are you on our side or not? That's in Georgia, for example. Though they haven't been pro-Russian, actually, they've been somewhat hostile to Russia. Over the last few years, they have not. They have refused to sanction Russia. They have refused to be, hostile in the way that the Europeans want them to be. And so
Don't
that's why their democracy is not democracy. The results of their election are unacceptable. And their president, who can't even speak Georgian but speaks French because that's where she was born and raised, is refusing to step down. So, there's another example of, in the name of democracy, I'm not going to listen to the will of the voters.
Yeah. Well, if you see on X Twitter when we're talking about Tbilisi and Georgia, what's going on there, it's all, Georgia will never be Russia. Say no to Russian oppression. We need to fight for fair and free democracies. That's everything that's being said there.
Right.
So maybe we can segue into Georgia right now. So
Okay.
can you tell us what's happening there? Just recap. I know we had a episode on it a couple months ago,
Yeah.
but we have new listeners now. So maybe you can kind of
Right.
tell us what's going on.
Okay. Well, what we're witnessing right now is just a textbook case of a color revolution. And it was actually, this has been tried so many times previously in Georgia. They had a color revolution, one of the first ones. I think it was in the early 2000s. And maybe it was Shevardnadze that was overthrown. Typically what happens is that an election is held, and then the opposition comes out. The opposition, which you have to understand is funded and organized and trained by Western NGOs. And I've heard that Georgia has like the greatest concentration of Western NGOs of any country in the world. Now these Western NGOs, they're well funded and they're operating in a poor country. So they can actually afford to pay like $10 an hour, even $20 an hour, which is just a phenomenal salary in a place like Georgia or Moldova or wherever. So, not only, so they really can buy influence, they can just buy loyalty. And, they train these people, these young people. And then when the election occurs and the wrong person wins, the one who isn't, enthusiastic about joining the EU or whatever, wants to maintain decent relations with Russia, well, then they hit the streets, and they've been trained in carrying out street protests, and then immediately the Western media supports them, and Western leaders come and actually go and visit them and show their support. Think of Victoria Nuland and the cookies in Maidan Square, right? That was another color revolution that ended tragedy, obviously, in Ukraine. um, but I think the important, but so far anyway, of course, the color revolutionaries succeeded in Ukraine as they succeeded in other countries. They managed to overthrow a duly elected government and install a government to their liking, but they haven't succeeded in Georgia, and it seems like that the Georgia Dream Party and their prime minister has, maybe because they've seen it happen so many times, they observed what happened in Ukraine, and in fact they bring this up again and again. We're not going to be like Ukraine. Look what happened. This is what if these people win, our future is Ukraine. And I think that probably resonates with a lot of Georgians. But even so, you see a lot of Ukrainian flags, among the protesters. And it must be said, there's all this talk about Russian influence. Nobody's found any Russians there in anywhere involved in this. But I've heard that that a third of the people that have the protesters that have been arrested recently are foreigners.
That's what I've heard
So,
as well.
right.
Oh, 30%
Yeah.
of the people being detained and arrested aren't even citizens of Georgia
Yeah. And you
and the
have like,
protests.
you have European MPs and going there and giving speeches, against Russian influence, which doesn't exist, but they don't seem the hypocrisy doesn't, they don't seem to be aware of what they're doing. Obviously they're interfering, but again,
Right.
because they're the good people, it doesn't matter.
Right.
So,
So
right.
we have the president of Georgia. Can you quickly maybe kind of define the distinction between the president of Georgia and the prime minister of Georgia? Because
Right.
that's a little confusing. When people hear the president,
Right.
they think that this is the
Right.
person that is really calling all the shots, but that's not really the case in Georgia, right?
Yeah, right, right. Yeah, president and prime minister have different meanings in different countries. In Georgia, the prime minister is the one with real power, and the president is largely a ceremonial post. The prime minister is a French citizen, the former, I believe, French ambassador to.
You mean the president? You mix it up.
Yeah, the
The
president.
president.
Okay, yeah,
Yeah,
the
yeah.
president. Yeah, the president. She's really a French woman. She is of Georgian ancestry, but she was born and raised in France, and can only speak a little bit of Georgian. She's basically French, but somehow she managed to occupy this position of the presidency in Georgia, and she's been using it throughout the protests, to condemn the government. I know earlier she was saying repeatedly that there was Russian involvement, the Russians were behind it. And then somebody actually asked her, for evidence. And if I recall correctly, she said, well, I don't have to. Like they didn't have to give any evidence in the U.S. about, Russian interference. So I'm not going to give, what.
We set the precedent.
Yeah, that's
so.
right. So anyway, now, yeah, recently she's continued to support the protesters, condemn the police, describe it as brutal and the protesters as peaceful. And clearly they're not. I've seen a lot of video, they're smashing windows and they're throwing firecrackers, and they've got this pyrotechnic gun that's pretty impressive, that shoots flames. And the police seem to be doing a very professional job. The thing is, I think, again, we have to give credit to the Georgian president and the Georgian Dream Party. They seem to.
The Georgian prime minister. You keep on mixing them
I'm
up.
sorry. Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
the
The
Georgian
Georgian prime minister and the Georgian Dream Party. I think they've learned the lessons from previous color revolutions. For example, in Ukraine, the it was Poroshenko, not Poroshenko, no, Lukashenko, I believe.
Yanukovych.
Yanukovych. I'm sorry. Okay, Yanukovych. You're right.
I got your back. Yeah.
Good. Thank you. Thank you. I do these things with names from time to time for some reason. Okay, but Yanukovych, he was the president, and he was the one who was, targeted by all these protests. And rather than cracking down, if he really was some evil authoritarian, he was constantly trying to negotiate with them, meet them halfway. He was kept on ceding ground, and every time he ceded ground to them, they just took it and they pushed harder, and eventually just pushed him out. Is what happened. It ended with a false flag incident, by the way, but the Georgian prime minister has not done that. He's held his ground firmly. I mean, they haven't cracked down violently. But they've been forceful. They have not ceded ground. They're not letting them camp out. They're trying to establish a permanent presence there right in front of the parliament building, and they keep on pushing them back. I think now they're increasing the number of arrests, and they may continue to do that. But it seems like he's handled it very effectively. But the president, the so-called Georgian president, has recently declared that she's not going to step down. She's supposed to step down within a couple of weeks, but she's not going to step down again in the name of democracy, of course. And she's completely supported by all the Western European leaders.
So, did the West, did the U.S., the EU, did they essentially appoint this woman, Salome? Did they back her and put her in as this?
I'm sure
president.
I'm sure they pulled a lot of strings. I don't know exactly how it happened. I really don't know.
And do you think she's receiving orders from people in Brussels or Paris or wherever?
I don't think she probably is to some extent, but I don't think they have to give her orders. She's just one of them. you know,
Mm.
and they all know they're of one mind on these things, you know. Anybody that's all friendly to Russia is bad. Anybody who refuses to obey, you know, the EU is evil and is obviously, you know, a Russian stooge. And that's the way they all talk, the way they all think, and she's just one of them.
So you don't think this color revolution will succeed? It looks like the people are
Yeah,
aware of what's going
yeah.
on, right? It's becoming more
I
apparent.
think that I believe and I certainly hope that the Georgia Dream Party succeeds. It looks like they're going to, but you just have to keep in mind that Georgia is a small, relatively poor country, you know, against some very powerful forces. The U.S. and the EU, you know, they're powerful and they have a lot of levers to pull. And you know, though this NGO law was passed, those NGOs are still there. They do have to now declare their funding. You know, that was Georgia's first sin, is that they actually demanded transparency.
But this is a
The
law that's pretty commonplace
Oh
across
yeah,
countries, and the
right.
U.S. definitely has
Yeah,
this. I
right.
mean,
It's
most
I
European
think it's
countries
even
have that, right?
modeled on the U.S. law. So I mean, it just you know, the hypocrisy is breathtaking. It just is. But it's just like these people don't. Obviously, they just think, you know, we're like, you know, we're one class of people. Again, it's the rules-based international order, you know, and that means that we make the rules and we give the orders. You know, that's you know, it's sounds like an exaggeration, but it clearly is the way they think. You know, it's just like, hey, they didn't obey our orders. You know, obviously they're not Democrats, or they need to be punished.
So these a third or 30% of these protesters are claimed to be citizens of other countries.
Well, they
Well,
are
what?
citizens of other countries. Yeah.
Right. Okay. So, but
Yeah.
are we funding them to go there? So is this a coordinated effort from
Quite
you know
possibly. I mean, these
agencies and
NGOs, right? These NGOs have a lot of money. You know, one of the it's not exactly an NGO actually, because it is a government organization. It's the National Endowment for Democracy, has a large presence in Georgia, and that is in fact it's basically it used to be a department of the CIA, and then the CIA a couple of decades ago decided to just make it public, and but it, you know, clearly its relationship to the CIA did not end when it became the NED. And you know, they're there and they support the other NGOs, and there's a lot of money that flows through there. There was some claim, for example, that $5 billion was spent in Ukraine to support, you know, the anti-government, anti-Russian forces there.
does the CIA, National Endowment of Democracy, they just have unlimited money? Are they just connected straight up to the U.S. printing press? So that's why they can just do this, and they just
Well, they don't have unlimited money, but clearly they have a lot of money. And the thing to remember again is that in these countries, that money goes a long way. If you can pay somebody $10 an hour, I mean, it's like paying somebody $80 an hour in this country. You know? And it's like a young person out of college having trouble finding a job and thinking, I got to work in a cafe or something, and I can get this kind of work. You know, this is great. I love this country. This is wonderful. Yeah, I'll go out and, you know, throw rocks
right
and smash windows for this country.
get
You
to shoot
know,
fireworks.
you're
If
right.
people should go on Twitter and just type in Tbilisi, because the I've never seen this many fireworks used in a protest. The
Yeah,
amount of
it's rather entertaining. I agree.
yeah, it almost looks like it reminded me of like the Clone Wars and Star Wars, laser blasters going across each side. It's really something to behold. So it seems like it's heating up. To me, it looks like. I
Yeah.
mean,
Well,
we
it's
saw these.
right. What I've heard is the crowds are dwindling. Actually, the numbers out there, but the ones that are still there are increasingly violent, and maybe so we're getting more and more people from, you know, abroad, real kind of professional agitators, and you know, as it becomes apparent to them that they're losing, they may do something. You know, we may see a false flag like we saw in the Maidan.
What was the false flag in Maidan? Was it the
Okay, it was
snipers?
actually, yeah, there were snipers, yeah, that shot. Um, yeah, who did? I think they shot the police there, and they were firing from a hotel. You know, there's I can't remember. I think it was a Canadian journalist who did very very good work on it. But then it was pinned. Okay, no, okay. Okay, I can't remember the details. I won't try to.
Okay.
Okay, but the thing is, it was actually carried out. Actually, I think by Azov types. The ultranationalists in Ukraine, but it was pinned on the police. But it wasn't. It was shown later. Like the firing was from a hotel, and that was occupied by these Azov types. But it was blamed on again government law enforcement, and that was the spark that finally set the fire that brought down Yanukovych. He ended up fleeing to Russia.
So you think that's a real risk here
Oh
in
yeah,
Georgia, that there will be
yeah,
a false flag? But
right,
do you think that most Georgian people are aware, especially if it's getting out that, hey,
yeah,
most of these people that are shooting at our parliament building, they're not even
right,
Georgian anymore. Who
yeah,
are these people? Get
yeah.
out of our
No, it's going
country.
to be harder for them to pull out. I mean, it's clear that Georgia learned from these previous color revolutions, especially the one in Ukraine, and they're bringing it up and they're pointing out the parallels. And so it's going to be harder for them to pull it off. But I think there's a very good chance they'll try, create some kind of incident. As they get desperate and see that it's not working and their numbers are dwindling, it's more likely that they're going to do something desperate.
Yeah, it feels like the jig is up for the United States. The veil, the mask has been lifted. People see what the U.S. is doing now. These
Yeah,
color revolutions. When you go down that rabbit hole, you realize how often we do this, and I
yeah,
think it's becoming more and more apparent to the rest of the world what's
right.
happening. So I just don't, and that's really our
Yeah,
forte, our specialty is regime change, our
yeah.
color
Right. We have
revolutions.
it's a playbook. I mean, we've used it again and again, and it with great success. Um, yeah, no, I think obviously a lot of people around the world have wisened up to it. But then it also must be said that, like in Georgia, though that they're a minority, there is a substantial minority that's enthusiastically supportive of this. So, I mean, they still have a hold on a lot of people. It's amazing. I was amazed, that there were Iranians that still, after all these years of these cruel economic sanctions and assassinations and everything, clearly carried out by the U.S. and Israel, and with the support of the West in general, that there were still Iranians that were pro-Western. You found them in the universities. But from what I hear, again, according to Professor Morandi, it's just like the genocide in Gaza has pretty much ended that. It's just they all along had this abiding faith in the West as being the land of the good, the great and the good, and if they're sanctioning us and assassinating our leaders, well, obviously it's for our own good or something. But then they saw the genocide in Gaza and they said, wait a second, and apparently it's like that Western pro-Western element is pretty much evaporated. But still, in places like Georgia, it's also my understanding it's pretty much gone in Russia too. There used to be a strong pro-Western element. It's gone, but in places like Georgia, it's still there and it's substantial and it is a threat to the government.
Right. I
But
think
it,
that's just
but I think the trend, you're right, is just against them, and that more and more people are having their eyes opened.